So far in the course, we've talked about getting ready for the exam, how to prepare for the exam, how to schedule it, how to take it. Well, now we've finally gotten down to where we're going to jump into some A-plus topics, and let's start with the BIOS. Now, some of the basics on the BIOS is a great place to start to talk about a computer, because this is the functionality that happens the instant we flip the switch or press the button and start our computer up. So the BIOS, or Basic Input Output System, is really a set of low-level instructions. It's really just computer code that runs that's used to start the PC. So when we turn on a PC, it starts what's called a bootstrap process, and it just kind of pulls itself up by the bootstraps. If you've ever heard that particular phrase used to describe someone who started with nothing, they became an entrepreneur, they started a business, they married a great husband or a great wife, they had some great kids, they got a nice car, all that kind of stuff, right? They pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, meaning they kind of worked their way up and they depended on their own integrity, their own hard work and everything. That's what's happening here. We have some low-level instructions, a basic machine level type code that runs. It's used to start the PC. The BIOS communicates with all the system devices to make sure that they're connected, to make sure they're running. This happens during what's called the POST, and that means Power On Self-Test routine that's coded into the BIOS. That's part of those low-level instructions that run. And keep in mind, the BIOS, the low-level code, is stored on an EEP ROM chip on the motherboard. All right, don't worry about what that means, but it used to be just on a regular old ROM, a read-only memory chip, but it was later added to an EE, and it's also called a CMOS chip, CMOS, and the only difference is the old ROM was read-only memory, which meant if you ever wanted to upgrade the BIOS, you had to actually replace that physical chip on the motherboard. And with the EEPROM, and then with the CMOS and stuff, we can update that thing with software. We don't have to actually replace that chip. So that's the big difference there. Now let's talk about CMOS just a second. CMOS means complementary metal oxide semiconductor. This is one of those strange situations in PCs where CMOS is actually the name not of what the object does, but how it's manufactured. But that's the name that stuck. And so when we're talking about CMOS, this is what provides the BIOS with information about the computer. So the list of hardware devices that are attached to the computer that should be working, that list is stored, and all the BIOS settings is stored out there in CMOS, and the code that's in BIOS refers to the CMOS to get that stuff. This is what provides the order of boot devices. Are we going to check for hard drive first, then for CD-ROM, then for USB, that sort of thing. The real-time system clock is maintained out there in CMOS. Again, the hardware inventory list. Hey, what pieces of hardware should I see here and what's been connected? What should be working here on startup? That's out there in CMOS. Any information the BIOS needs to run when it runs its code to start the computer up is stored out there in CMOS. Now, the BIOS or the CMOS can be updated on modern PCs just using software. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, and from time to time you'll have to update the BIOS. Sometimes you'll add a new piece of hardware, you'll add RAM, whatever. Usually those things will update the BIOS and the CMOS settings automatically. Sometimes you have to do it manually to get things to happen. Okay, now let's make sure you understand something here. There's a little opportunity here to throw something in that will really help you out on the exam and in the real world. First of all, the BIOS and the CMOS, these are stored really on read-only memory chips on the motherboard, ROM chips. Now, data that's stored on a read-only memory chip is called firmware. Data that's stored on RAM or random access memory is called software. So if you've ever wondered what the difference between firmware and software is, there you go. If it's stored on read-only memory, meaning that I can't change it unless I have a special piece of software that I download from the manufacturer. Again, we'll talk about that later when we talk about upgrading or updating the BIOS. Anything that's stored on read-only memory, it's not very easily changed. It's called firmware. Anything that I can change readily in memory on RAM is called software. So there's the difference, okay? So that's just a little bit of basics about BIOS and CMOS. Make sure that stuff makes sense to you, and then we'll move on to flashing or updating the BIOS. So join me for flashing the BIOS in that video.